The craze that has truly taken over the country is the SPAC.
The SPAC craze continuing.
And retail traders have been all over it.
SPACs, or special purpose acquisition companies, have caused a lot of noise this year.
Part of the reason why SPACs are exploding is just there's a stock market gold rush, right? Everything has been going up and to the right for the past, year. And SPACs are really just kind of a byproduct of that.
5 years ago, 10 SPACs went public. This year, over 350 SPACs are already listed on stock exchanges.
In the aggregate, this stuff does matter. And if you have, hundreds of companies going public via SPAC, moving into the markets, that ultimately is going to have an impact on if the markets go up or down, and that does impact your personal portfolio. A SPAC itself is a company, but it's not a company the way we think about it. It doesn't have a product, it doesn't have any revenue, it doesn't really even have much in terms of active management. All it really is a publicly traded ticker symbol. And what it's trying to do is go buy another company.
Let's break this down. A SPAC starts with an initial IPO. This is the first of two big transactions. A group of investors get together and agree to manage a SPAC. Then they raise a bunch of money, forming a shell company. The shell company goes through an IPO, gets a ticker symbol, and is traded on the stock market, usually at $10 a share. These early investors have some pretty good protections. The money raised in the IPO is held in escrow. Picture this as a lockbox.
So that's transaction number one. Number two is kind of called the merger, or actually the de-SPAC. And transaction number two is where they actually go and find a company to buy and purchase it.
SPACs typically have 2 years to acquire another company, or early investors get their money back. Before a SPAC merges with a target company, it normally needs more money from PIPEs, or private investments in public equity.
These are often third-party institutional investors like Fidelity or BlackRock, and they're the ones who help finance the actual transaction. They're kind of money on top to get the deal done.
These PIPEs are essential. Investors can redeem their stocks for cash at any point before the SPAC merges with another company, potentially reducing the amount of money a SPAC has to work with. And so the money from these PIPEs ensures that SPACs can acquire someone else. Trouble is, there are only a handful of PIPEs for a lot of SPACs. And remember, SPACs can merge with any company. It doesn't matter what the company does or how financially stable it proves. And that's because
if you go public via SPAC, you are not liable for future financial projections going out as far as you want. If you go public in a traditional way, you can only go 2 years out on those projections.
SPACs have been around since the 90s. Back then,
they were for pretty small companies, and they were fairly rare. There'd be maybe 10, 15 of them a year, so no one paid all that much attention to them.
At the time, companies were going public via traditional routes like IPOs, earlier than most companies today.
In the 1990s, it was easier for small cap companies to go public because there were banks that specifically catered to those sorts of companies. There just aren't as many of them today.
Then in the aughts, companies started staying private for longer periods of time.
A lot of privately held tech startups didn't really want to go public, or at least they didn't want to go public too soon. What that's created is this giant backlog of very valuable, kind of mature tech companies that are looking for ways to go public. So while you do have some kind of speculative companies, autonomous vehicle companies going public via SPAC, you also have just a huge pipeline of companies that SPAC sponsors can kind of go to and make the argument, hey, come public now. You've been private for a very long time. There have been more SPACs raised since the beginning of 2020 than there had ever been raised in aggregate in history going back to the 1990s.
Here's what you need to know about how they work. SPACs are shell companies listed on stock exchanges. They're formed to acquire new companies, or de-SPAC, and they can acquire any company, no matter what it does or how financially stable it is.
The thing about stocks, whether that stock came about because of an IPO or via a SPAC, is that ultimately this is kind of how a lot of us get paid, right? These are the things that are in our 401ks. These are the things that are in our pensions, whether we're a public employee, whether we're a private employee.
No matter what your portfolio looks like, understanding the hype around these kinds of trends is important. Watch more about that in the final video.